Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Shed. I'm Maxine Fakara, PraxisAuril CEO, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Shed Talk, where we will talk candidly with an invited guest from the knowledge exchange ecosystem. And we're all really looking forward to hearing from Joe Marshall, the CEO at the National Centre for Universities and Business today. So before we begin, a couple of housekeeping points as always. As some of you may have noticed already, we're using a slightly different format for this session, mostly so that you can see people's names popping up as they come in. But as we start the session proper, obviously we will have everyone's videos and sound turned off, and we'll use the chat function to log your questions as usual. So do send questions in whenever you think of them, and we'll do our best to queue you up appropriately. Do please remember to note your name and organisation when you ask a question, because some people have personal names on Zoom that might not be recognisable to us. If you do have any difficulties with anything on the call, then do just ping us a quick message on the private chat function and we'll help you with that. To remind you that we are recording this session and it will be made available after the event to PraxisAuril members. So with no further ado, let me hand over to Sean Fielding, Director of Innovation, Impact and Business at the University of Exeter, and now immediate past chair of PraxisAuril. It looks as though there have been some refurbishments in the shed since we last saw you in it, Sean. Please tell me you haven't spent the whole winter in there.
Yes, this is the coming up to week 49 in the shed, I think, and enjoying every minute of it. But did have to put some extra insulation in during that cold snap that we had recently. So, but it's great to be back in the shed and welcoming you all to a Shed Talk. And of course, a Shed Talk is so called because it does involve a talk, and also at least some of it comes from my shed in South Devon. And because of that, we ask you to be not too worried if you hear seagulls squawking outside, and occasionally the mournful sound of a siren of one of the cruise liners that's parked up off the coast of South Devon. There are 7 of them in the sea off where I live at the moment. So that tells you about areas that have been affected by the pandemic. The idea of this series of talks was to create an opportunity for the knowledge exchange community to hear from influential figures at a time when we couldn't get out so much anymore. And as I said, it's been going now for all the way through this year. This is the 8th of the talks that we have done. And today I'm delighted to welcome to the shed Joe Marshall from Ncub. And Joe, prior to joining the National Centre, he has been working closely in government, a number of roles, also as an academic, specialising in government education policy and practice. Worked with a whole range of different organisations like UNESCO, the World Health Organization and the European Parliament. He joined, well, he's been at Ncub for a while, but became the chief executive in the summer of 2018, having been the kind of the eminence grise behind the screen for some time there, and making it all happen. And I think one of your last things before you joined Ncub, Joe, was working for the Olympics. And so that was the kind of high point of this country's life, wasn't it? From the Olympics to a Shed Talk, Joe, it's really great to welcome you to the shed today.
Lovely to be here. Thank you, Sean. And yeah, looking forward to it. So
what we normally do is to just ask questions of each other, and hopefully there are some interesting answers. And the idea is that the community gets a feel for the things that are important amongst in other groups around the ecosystem. So the first thing, I think, just to make sure we are kind of orientated in the right place, is tell us about Ncub. Why is Ncub important?
Good. That's a good opening question, Sean. I like a good challenge. I think Ncub it sits in a very unique place. I mean, most organisations usually use the unique word. I think we sit at that sort of interface between universities, business, and government. And some people might refer to that as the sort of triple helix. I think one of the things that we try to do is mobilise and engage that senior leadership. And certainly the work we've done recently on the task force is try to bring people who are at chair, chief exec level and think about why collaboration with universities is really important, and where they see universities as part of their kind of supply and ultimately kind of value chain. But also that we try to engage, pro-vice chancellors, vice chancellors, and think about why, why the knowledge exchange agenda in its broadest and fullest sense is really important. This is not just about kind of research and innovation and the very intricate and nuanced world of tech transfer at one end of the spectrum, but it's also about graduate employability, it's about enterprise, it's about the skills and talent we need. And I think both universities and businesses are both broad churches. They aren't just interested in singular parts. Universities have a talent as well as a research agenda, and so do businesses there. And I think the government as well has a sort of, the portfolio was within one government department when it was BIS. It's now BAYS and has, certainly in an English context, a sort of the sort of research base and UKRI agenda, but you've also got DFE. And I think organisations like NCUB try to bring all of that together and look at it as holistically as possible. So, I think we try to add value, support the ecosystem, and ultimately try and improve it.
And do you think you're in a unique position to do that because of the membership structure that you've got and how it operates?
Yeah, I think this is. I remember when I came, as I finished at 2012, I came into this world sort of back end of that, and actually one of the very first events I went to was the Auril conference in Sheffield, and was sort of an array of different sort of acronyms thrown my way. I think one of the things that I think Ncub tries to do is understand those different types of cohorts of people, of communities. And so I think there are a lot of organizations in this space, but I think increasingly we're starting to collaborate, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, at some point over the next hour or so, but how we collaborate with others. I think there's a lot. Having worked in universities, the REF agenda, or REE when it was my day, the TEF agenda, increasingly now the kind of KEF agenda, this is becoming a more and more embedded part of universities, and increasingly more, not that we use the same language, but businesses increasingly look at collaboration as being part of their open innovation platforms, about new ways in which they recruit and develop and nurture talent. So I think, what we're trying to do is work with lots of other organizations to really push this agenda forward, but it's still relative to the research agenda and the teaching agenda, not as well formed or as well established. And so I think we all need to be kind of pushing and to make this more and more embedded in everyday practice for both academics and business.
Yeah, kind of the more the merrier at this point, it feels.
Absolutely.
So what do you think in terms of the relationship currently between universities and businesses? You produce your State of the Relationship report each year. What do you think about how this looks from your perspective now? Is it thriving?
I certainly think that the UK has a really strong ecosystem. I think it's very. I'm sure we all do, and many people on this call are only members of both of our respective membership, of which there is healthy overlap and connectivity. I've probably had that moment, which is what do you do? You did this, and right. I think many of us will look back at 2020, in which effectively university business collaboration was the headline, the second headline of the year. The second headline after, yes, there's a pandemic and there's a massive virus. The solution was, here is the University of Oxford and here is AstraZeneca collaborating. Neither could do it on their own, and this is the kind of a fantastic example of university business collaboration that is, you know, now synonymous with the Oxford vaccine or the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And so you don't, we you know, I think, you know, hopefully explaining what we do to lay people or family members becomes easier to do in the sort of public consciousness. And I think when you talk to people who, you know, colleagues on the business side and on the university side who do this internationally, I know you work with many colleagues within the PraxisAuril community, with colleagues in Autumn and in UIN and UIDP and others, and then you can make comparisons about how the UK fares. I think the UK has, you know, is world, you know, genuinely world leading in this space. It certainly, you know, can hold its own in terms of the maturity of how those relationships are brokered, how those relationships are connected. I think, but I also think that doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement. And one of the things that certainly we try to do a lot of is invariably, because it's still immature, people will get animated and excited about, you know, IP and IP share, and if they've had a bad experience with a particular university on a particular deal, all of tech transfer as becomes ubiquitous as being everything that tech transfer is, therefore everything of knowledge exchange, therefore it's all bad, and therefore we need a single tech transfer office for the UK. We need a single IP agreement that will uniformly resolve all these problems. All graduates are rubbish, and therefore we need one university, possibly within the Golden Triangle, to do everything, and then it'll be all fine. And I think the strength of the UK system is its diversity. You know, I think there isn't one size fits all, and I think that's brilliant, and I think adds to the complexity in which it's feeding different markets. However, because there's diversity, it's also one of its probably greatest challenges. It's that there isn't one size that fits all, and therefore if you're looking, certainly on the business side, for a kind of uniformity of it, there's that becomes problematic. And I think the other point I've often reflected on is that because it's still immature, certainly on the more kind of technical, not technical, but commercial ends of negotiation, there isn't the maturity in the system that says, I want to do a deal with that university. If the terms aren't right for me, then why do I treat them differently to a different, they're not a supplier per se, but it's, we kind of go, oh, the system's wrong. And you're like, well, actually if you were dealing in this in your supply chain, you would just go to a different, you know, you'd just go to a different supplier. It just happens that you think that the university should be cheaper, or you should be able to get access to it for free because it's been publicly funded. And I think, you know, I think it's a maturity agenda for me, which is on both sides, which is why I think, you know, I think the state relationship is a really important benchmark as to how that is improving and developing, but there will always be areas to improve and develop.
Yeah. And and if you do you think that government, the people you talk to in government, because part of your work is about persuading people that this is important, when you talk to people in government, do you think they get that that it's a maturing activity, that there are, you know, good and bad, and you know, increasingly good, and that we stand up against the world? Or do you think that they still are thinking about the sort of two cultures, that there's a business culture and a university culture, and they actually don't quite work very well together? What do you think? Is it still, do people still think that we are unnatural bedfellows?
I think it's always difficult, and I think there's always a role for organisations like Ncub to help. You know, we add to the informed evidence base, and why I say that is that, you know, invariably ministers, you know, and politicians and others are used to being lobbied and influenced and channeled, and you know, some people are very successful at it and can have the ear of a new minister or an established minister or a secretary of state with a particular agenda. And I think what we try to do is counter that with, you know, robust, reliable, all the things that, you know, good academic research is about. You know, it's about, you know, replicability of research. It's about, you know, balanced and proportionate balance samples and all of those sorts of things. But just trying to say, in an aggregate form, these are the issues, of which there are still issues to work through, but also to look at it from the different perspectives. I mean, I always think that, you know, the real nuances of kind of IP policy or other things, if you ask universities to behave differently, then they will. But if you know, if you want them to be more commercial, then I'm sure universities could be very much more commercial if they wanted to be. But actually, as charitable and public organisations that have a broader remit, and also a kind of cross-discipline, as in, you know, the research informs their teaching will inform their knowledge exchange. You know, all of these things are interrelated. If you suddenly put, which I know Augur and other things have tried to do, a sort of unit price on my tuition fee pays for this, and it only pays for that, then what happens about your research activities? It only pays for that, and you can't talk about that when you're teaching, and you can't use that to do, you know, third stream or knowledge exchange activities. So I think we try to sort of, and, you know, there are very seasoned people in government who help, you know, we can channel messages through, but also sometimes a bit, you know, be careful what you wish for, ministers, because if you open that Pandora's box, it has other either intended or unintended consequences.
But you're describing quite a sophisticated message there, and quite often the audience you're dealing with are not able to take that message. They're looking for simple things that cut through. Do you think people are getting the message that actually there's a professionalism and there's good outcomes, or not at the moment?
So I think one of the things that I think is a really important, and, you know, it probably doesn't go unsurprised that I would say this, but I think in all of the machinery changes in government, the advent of UKRI, the bringing to, you know, the abolition of HEFGI in an English context, the challenges that devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have faced in terms of some of the Barnett consequentials and other things, I think some of the key officials at Research England who have stayed, who bring with them that kind of you know, HEFGI DNA. There's two ways to sort of win the argument. One is the economic one. For the amount of investment you get in, what are you getting back? And I think knowledge exchange continues to demonstrate in HIFE in England, in UIF in Scotland, and the equivalents in Northern Ireland and Wales, the multiplier effects are phenomenal. And so when you're trying to say to ministers, forget all of the nuanced arguments I've just made, 250 million pounds of HIFE gives you this multiplier. If you want to pull that apart, feel free, but I think, you know, that's a good return on investment on anybody's books. And the same often applies in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. But I also think we also try and point to the successes, not just in economic terms. I think there's a increasingly you see knowledge exchange, you know, rising to you know, the knowledge exchange framework, the knowledge exchange concordat isn't just a question of here's a multiplier, we filled in our HEBSIS returns and it's demonstrated X. Actually, the really positive stories about, you know, ref impact case studies and the relationships there, therefore you're playing into the research agenda. You've also got the relationship between teaching and entrepreneurship, enterprise, but also just broader employability opportunities that, you know, if I think certainly about your institution, Sean, your connectivity in your team is embedded across the entire university, but is also intricately linked to your business unit, as it's, you know, it's not, they are one and the same. You know, you are integrated and a unit, and I think that model pervades across lots of places where you can point to employability, enterprise, entrepreneurship, broader teaching benefits, work experience, degree apprenticeships, but then all of the full range of kind of much more commercialization activities. and then being able to tell those stories. And I think that's one of the things that NCUB has tried to do over the years is to bring to life and showcase those success stories, of which they are not just the very high profile AstraZeneca ones, but it's social enterprise, it's arts, humanities, it's cultural, it's and also I know Siobhan Jordan's on the call from Interface. It's also the the role of small businesses, how we connect into most economies are dominated by SMEs. How does the university play a role in that levelling up agenda, which I'm sure we'll touch on as well.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you're saying is there is if you can demonstrate a strong multiplier and a big number, then that goes a long way to settling people down. And then you follow up with some stories of success that resonate with people. And the challenge with that is the question of the volume of those. How many do you do, and who do you send them to, and how do you engage people with them? And that seems to me an ongoing responsibility for us to be engaged in. And you touched on the pandemic earlier and the great success of that direct contribution to the to vaccines, and we also seen really significant contributions across the piece from universities into society during this period. And you produced some reports recently on the state of innovation in the during the pandemic. Did you get a feel, beyond the Oxford piece, whether those stories have had an effect? They are resonating. That it is a it is making a difference.
I mean, I think it was a piece in Bloomberg last summer, sort of either between the first and second lockdowns, where I think Bloomberg wrote. There was a piece in Bloomberg that said that the UK, and in particular UK universities, have had a good pandemic, if that's not a sort of slight oxymoron, or but from vaccines to ventilators to testing centres through to supporting a whole raft of supporting the NHS in lots of different ways. There's lots of academics who have dual appointments in hospital positions and in universities, and universities absolutely just said, right, put a hold on that, absolutely be in the front line in terms of supporting colleagues in dealing with the full brunt of the pandemic. So I think there's some amazing stories, and I think certainly politicians and policymakers recognise the role that universities had and were having up and down the country, and the impacts that is having globally. I think the one observation I would make there, and it was telling in the report, which was that there are a series of kind of contradictions in some areas. Business engagement units in universities have never been busier. The inquiries have flooded in. CPD training. Academic insights about remote working, the psychology of dealing in pandemics. The sort of drawing on the genuine expertise of universities to help and support transition. But also, and in some areas where labs have stayed open and activities have carried on, you've not seen a drop. But in other areas where trying to engage in the aerospace or the automotive sectors at the moment has just fallen off a cliff. You've got a number of sectors that are kind of going, will we return back to normal? And therefore, the knock-on consequences, if people aren't flying, people then aren't using airplanes. If people aren't using airplanes, they're not using big Rolls-Royce engines. Therefore, Rolls-Royce its business model becomes more problematic, and all of the sort of knock-on consequences. So I think it's been, and we also saw, and many people on the call will be aware, for many businesses, R&D spend is effectively a proportion of profit from sales in prior year. So, the activities that we're seeing in this financial year, if you're through to the end of March, are all profits from 1920. Therefore, in some respects, that spend is committed. It might take longer to deliver, but Rolls-Royce per se don't necessarily want their money back, or Unilever or whoever, and those projects are probably still relevant. However, what happens if your profits have dropped this year? And therefore your ability to invest in the next year becomes really problematic. And businesses will be looking to their bottom line to see where they can make savings. So I think what we're kind of keen to do is look, we identified some initial both opportunities and challenges. I think that's been really helpful to both BEIS, UKRI, and I know certainly the development administrations have been in touch to sort of see what cuts of the data apply to them. And I think certainly it's doom and gloom, nor is it a bed of roses. And so I think being able to point out some specifics and then just keep monitoring it, I think we have to watch and see, and a bit like the financial crisis in 2007-8 and beyond, it's difficult to know how this is going to pull through the system over the next few years.
Yeah, I think you're right. This next year is going to be more challenging, and not just on the business income, but also in the public money available. Lots of money has had to go to solve the here and now, and that may have an effect on future budgets. The other thing I think about the pandemic is how it's changed the way we operated. We demonstrated that we did have the ability to drop everything and focus on certain things if we really needed to, and that we could work across institutions, we could work in all kinds of different ways. And of course, it's people are now working from their sheds, and that has made a change as well. What do you think about what does business as usual look like in the future? Do you think are we going to go back to business as it was, and are there things we can learn from this about where we, how we identify the good things we're looking for, and how we measure those things, and how we know that we've done a good job?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it would not. I'm certainly not expert enough to make any wild predictions that about how much things will return to normal. I do think one of the really interesting moving a lot of meetings online has removed a lot of the challenges of geography, and so certainly at the sort of tech transfer, university spin out investor end, there's always been that thing of investors want to see the whites of the eyes of the people they're investing in, and so those people have to come to London where the investors are more often than not. In this sort of world, that's not possible, and so investors have had to jump onto Zoom calls and try to read rooms and look into the whites of people's eyes. But I think it's opened up. I think it's democratized. I think if you think about the Connecting Capabilities Fund, if you think about some of the work that some of the the Merciers Park Walks of this world IP groups, they can now scout and scour in different places, that means for organizations like Set Squared, for some of the other CCF schemes that have come on stream, that they don't have to all come to London, and it's not, therefore geography has kind of changed. I think it's a different type of, I think a lot of us are all looking forward to face-to-face meetings again, and having a beer, and certainly coming to conferences and getting away from certainly this screen for more than a couple of days would be brilliant. But I do think it will probably be accelerated the ways in which we can also do things, and our expectations. It's not unsurprising that Amazon has had a very good global pandemic, because it's got exactly the service people need, and I think we're becoming more and more used to and embedded with digital platforms and other technologies. there will always be a need for a balanced and broad approach, and I certainly think that knowledge exchange will never become fully digital and automated. But I certainly think we've seen with Confer some of the sort of changes in it's the speed, the ability. We pushed out some funding calls from Innovate UK and others in a very targeted way that said, Innovate were dealing with some huge surge demand on their big schemes. But, if you want to get to 300 therapeutics companies with a funding call and match them to relevant experts in an academic sense, Confer and other platforms can very quickly do those sorts of things. I mean, it's removing some of the what you really want to do is build the relationships. That's the bit that takes time and effort. Helping to speed up some of that finding, and also just be made aware of. I think that's the really exciting bit.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So if you, so generally, lots of changes have happened in this in the pandemic. We've had new ways of responding to things. We're still measuring stuff in the same sort of way as we were before, and there is the HEBC review going on at the moment. But a lot of the arrangements for getting things out of the door quickly have been done, without expecting significant income streams or with early contractual arrangements all in place. And yet those in the end are the things that we are judged on. What do you think about the future ways of measuring success? Where do you think we're going to get to? How do we judge success as we go forward? Someone who's just been, part of my job title includes the word impact. And so, we are looking hard at ref impact case studies at the moment. And, quite honestly, there's some fantastic successes that have come out of university research, which are, many of which have touched my team and that we've helped with, but never would have generated, they're not going to generate income in the way that we would have looked at as success before. But they have certainly changed the world in some way. What do you think that's going to mean for us going on in the future? And before you answer that, I'll give you just a second to think about that. Just remind everybody that if people have particular questions they want to ask to Joe, then if you put them in the chat, I will try and make sure there's a moment to answer them. So don't forget to write in the chat. Joe, impact and how we measure success.
So two thoughts. One, I think, is around the knowledge exchange framework in certainly England, and whether or not that gets adopted elsewhere. And the second would be around, I think, the sort of impact agenda. And Sean, you and I have talked about this previously about a kind of an impact plus type agenda. I think just on the first one, I think as always, Research England have sort of taken a mandate from Joe Johnson. They've sort of said, yes, okay, we need a knowledge exchange framework to complement your other frameworks. But there is a fantastic understanding of what knowledge exchange is about and what it covers, and also where the gaps are in the data. And I think Hamish and Alice Frost should be sort of commended for their work in terms of they are always the first to say, and if they aren't, then apologies for misquoting them, but they recognise more than anybody that the HEBSIS is income as a proxy for impact, but it all becomes it's all proxy, and invariably the battles that they've won on behalf of the sector, especially when dealing with Treasury, it is about multipliers and it is about economic benefit and return. But I think the KEF is an ability for certainly Alice, Hamish, ultimately David Sweeney, to be thinking about what are the alternative model, metrics that we could use. And Hamish has been poring over this for a couple of years. How do you capture impact, value, return in the social sciences? How do you think about your contribution in terms of civic responsibility? How do you, HIFE in the English context is partly funded through the Department for Education. So how do you make sure that we're not just completely obsessed with kind of commercialization and in particular, the sort of very, very technical tech transfer end. So I think, you kind of get the feeling that there is a sort of sea change coming, and that if nothing else, HEBC will feed into a broader narrative, which we don't have at the moment, which the KEF will capture for us. But I think that is work in progress, and certainly something that we've been quite animated over on for the last couple of years has been the voice of the user. I think one of the things, whatever happens to, well, sounds like its days are numbered, but the sort of National Student Survey has had, when I was leaving academia, it was one of the things that was just coming in. And there's, lots of, oh, no, we can't ask students what they think of our teaching. That's, they'll just mark us really badly. But actually, if you frame it right, if you think about the user as not as a customer, I've had lots of healthy discussions with Hamish about customers, but actually it's a really important feedback loop. How are you treating your user journey? Simple ways in which to navigate the university, to connect, timely response. It's thinking about the other rather than yourself. So I think the KEF, the voice of the user, is a really important part. And then I think to the impact agenda, I think there is an array of, I think there's two things I'd say. One, very quickly, the ref itself has become an industry in itself, and the ref case studies, it feels to me that if as a sector, and as if certainly we should be trying to do as much as we can now with those case studies as calling cards, as examples, as ability to inspire others to come in and do others. But I think also, I think we need to use them to tell different stories about the impact we're having. And that might be, multiplier effects. It might be about the role. And it's very difficult because you don't have many kind of counterfactuals. But, if that hadn't happened, then what really, because the university did this and this academic work with them, that then happened, it might bring economic, but it might bring other impacts and other benefits. And I think it's only a personal view, but if you draw the impact agenda, broadly speaking, came around about 10 years ago, the genesis of that was Treasury's having to make really tough decisions post-financial crisis about where it invests public money. And invariably, it wants to be able to say, we've got this shrunken public funds. How do we get the best return for the UK PLC? And every single government department had to say what it would do with the money to contribute to the recovery of the UK economy. In biz at the time, impact agenda was the thing. What I wouldn't be surprised if there is a post-pandemic impact plus type agenda. And I do wonder if, this time, this isn't just some bankers who have acted kind of loose and fast, and therefore we've all got to pick up the price. We've all lived through this pandemic, and therefore we recognise the impact it's going to have on our economy and society more generally. And therefore, I would hope that the sectors on both sides will respond in terms of being able to demonstrate what the use of public money is going to do in terms of the economic recovery.
Mm. Actually, Leanne Kenyon has put a question in the chat about the point at which you kind of identify the impact. Sometimes that's one of the big challenges. A partnership has happened, some new development has emerged, and you can demonstrate something's changed. And then if you come back 3 years later, something more has changed. It's developed further. And I think it strikes me as one of the challenges of this is getting those kind of points of the snapshots right, when you take those impacts. And often that's why the spin out company type approach is much easier to do, because you basically say, oh, well, we created a company, there's a logo and a chief executive, that's a point, you can point at that and say, well, that's there's definitely an impact. And a bit later on you can look at the how that organization has grown. But actually what you see when you look back at those ref impact case studies is over 7 years, quite often some of them are continued from previously, and you've still got change and development over 15 years. So there's a there's a really interesting point, I think, about the moment when you take, when you take the view. That's a key thing. I don't know if you have a view on that at all, but Leanne's saying even the point when the results of that research actually then come back into the feedback loop into teaching, and then change the way in which you prepare people for the world as they go forward. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Maybe a question we'll pose to Thomas Coates-Erickson later on, who I see is on the call. So we see if he's got any answers. But what do you think about that? Just the moment you decide your impact.
I mean, I would probably say a couple of reflections. One is that certainly, I think the system, it kind of comes back to my maturity argument. I think the system is becoming more mature, and is becoming more mature both in terms of how it acts, but also how it captures its successes. And to my user, voice of the user piece, it's not failures, but making sure that it responds. But I'd also say that this will be the second ref cycle for impact case studies. And so you've now got 2 data points. You've got increasingly, in a world of data analytics and data machine learning, certainly we're doing some interesting work, not in Confer, but as a sort of downside, and hopefully with Thomas, we're going to do some work, which is using the data inside Confer to sort of start, that company that we've profiled had an Innovate UK award. It probably had QR funding, so it had some ref funding. It's probably involved in an impact case study. Can you start to join the dots? Can you have one cohort that did some work, one cohort that didn't? So I think it's opening up some really fascinating. What we're now getting more and more data points, and my point to Leanne would be, I think as the system matures more and more, we will be looking to trace back. Was that a Hive-enabled project? Was that, and you saw this a little bit last year. Research England published a report demonstrating its Hive funding, or might have even been the year before that actually, its Hive funding and its relationship between Hive and Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund areas. And so the more we can sort of basically say, if you took Hive away, you wouldn't have had all of this Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund activity, or not in the same way or at the same speed. So I think you're starting to see policymakers make those connections, and I think universities will start to make those connections. And I think we will become more sophisticated at remembering it's not just a university spin out, but actually, that started there and that was a KTP, right? And then that became that was an innovation back, then jumped and now it's a spin out. Okay, right. How do we capture that? But also, how do we keep an eye on it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always that point where you're not sure whether you're there yet. Have we actually got an outcome? Just since I mentioned Thomas, you've been partnering and helping to launch Thomas Erickson's new centre in Cambridge. What do you think? What do you think that will tell us that we don't already know?
Oh, provocative question. Well, I think it will do 2 things. I think fundamentally it will give us robust, I think, what Thomas has done for Research England over the last few years is, he is an exceptional academic, an exceptional researcher and academic, and brings rigor and analytical understanding. And I think the unit just scales that up and puts him on him and the team on a national platform. And I think will be phenomenal. But I also think that Thomas's work, and we're delighted to partner with him on exactly this agenda, which is you don't know what you don't know. And I think the pandemic has shown that if we just assume that knowledge exchange will stay the same, and all the things I've just whittled on about KTPs or innovation vouchers or through to spin out deals, if we assume that everything's going to stay the same, then I would probably say we're going to sleepwalk, rather than leap forward. And I think what Thomas can do is think about trends both nationally, nationally and internationally, and really bring to life, and be a provocation to the sector that if it stands still, it was likely to go backwards, and have that kind of intellectual bandwidth in the system to push boundaries And so, you know, I think it's a kind of classic Donald Rumsfeld, you don't know what you don't know. But this unit, I think, is a fantastic addition to this, to us as a sector, that will challenge our thinking, gather new insights and data, you know, and hopefully be a good provocation. And hopefully I've not embarrassed Thomas too much.
You can put something in the chat if he wants to come in. But I agree with you. I think we do need to really understand the things that we take for granted, and make sure that other people understand them too. And PraxisAuril is really pleased to be you know, a part of this as well. And we think the practitioners aspect will really help in making this information really valuable. Just about so we've got 10 or so minutes to go. I'm thinking about your past. As your degree, I think, was geography and sports science. So just to come back to geography, one of these big things at the moment is leveling up, or well, leveling up, connecting up, but then also global Britain as a key thing. But the sort of the whole geography piece around knowledge exchange, you touched on it a bit, but I wonder if do you think we'll see progress in a strategy for the sort of geographical focus of knowledge exchange, or do you think it's all a bit of distraction, smoke and mirrors at the moment, and things will end up being the same as they were?
That's a question, Sean. I think that you could answer that in lots of different ways. I think the levelling up agenda for the last few years, my sort of broad take on it is devolution and localism, in though different arguments, is a kind of pendulum, and we have been for probably the last 10 years increasingly, I would argue, towards more devolution. You know, you've got clearly you've talked about global Britain. We've also clearly had one referendum in the last 10 years about whether or not Scotland stays, so there may well be another one depending on whether or not sturgeon and salmon make up or not in the next day or so. I think we are living, as the pendulum goes increasingly towards kind of devolution. Localism is on the sort of ascendancy, and therefore universities playing a really important role, in terms of their civic responsibility, civic role, civic mission, but also just think in terms of being embedded in their place. And I think what's fascinating, I think the minister made the sort of first public declaration of this just before Christmas at the UUK conference, where it's the R&D places strategy, emphasis on the plural, a sort of my sort of interpretation is a recognition that this isn't about kind of just simply leveling up. This is also about recognizing how you support specific places to be the best that they can. Clearly, I think politically there is the whole blue wall now, and how you demonstrate that the Conservatives can keep the North, and to an extent, can they keep the union together? So what will they do to try and with Scotland? Clearly, Brexit, I think, has thrown up. We are going to have quite a lot of challenges with Northern Ireland, and what happens there, and then clearly. Not a million miles away from you, Sean, I'm sure that there will be a Cornish uprising at some point, and independence will be being called for. But I think it comes a little bit back to the conversation we just had about impact. Can universities demonstrate that they are kind of active participants, active partners in their place? And I think I would argue that universities are brilliant at being able to think locally, nationally, and internationally. But that doesn't mean that they're not beyond a provocation to try and do more of it, to do it better, to do it differently. And I think, the referendum result probably shocked lots of us in our communities and inside universities, but within probably square mile of a university, there are probably big swathes of the population who voted A, for Brexit, B, they didn't see the role that the European Union, or by proxy the university, did. So we all do ERDF projects, we're all doing big stuff that we think is really important locally, nationally, internationally. But if we haven't convinced others, and you're seeing, I think, there's the work that Case did with Public First last year. If we do get to 2.4%, if we do get to that scale of investment, then I think one of the really critical provocations is that you suddenly research spend, university money going into universities, puts universities on a par with perhaps health spending or Ministry of Defence spending. We need to be able to justify and make the case, and more than that, bring people in with us, that the people in, the AstraZeneca Oxford partnership isn't a single thing. It becomes, Exeter's work with the Met Office, Interface's work with SMEs, and the whisky or the other production parts of the Scottish economy, but actually really telling that story, in not just telling that story, but being embedded partners, I think becomes really important. And it's part of what I always think about is whether or not you are in a place or you are place making. And that for me is, putting universities are in a really strong place, not just to have nice, pretty pictures of Exeter or London or Coventry. Actually, how do you really put these places on the map and make them feel vibrant, which parts of these places do because they've got a university, but more than that, like place making becomes really important.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction, being in a place or place making. And certainly our experience is that pretty much we end up being the only people with the capacity to look at our region dispassionately, if you like, and help make the case for for where the opportunities are. So that's fascinating, and that's a really helpful steer for everyone, I think. I'd like to just end on the point about you touched on right at the beginning, which is Ncubs' role and its role as one of a number of players that can have influence in this space, and what you see as the potential for collaboration and further work. We already work quite closely together, but with PraxisAuril. So the PraxisAuril Ncub relationship. How do you see that developing over time?
I would hope. I think both organisations have, metaphorically speaking, been on a bit of a journey. That you've gone through the merger, you've got, a stronger, bigger presence because there's, two organisations have come together, and I think we've gone on our own journey, and we're coming through the other side of that. I think if I think about the work that we're doing, I always think, we're doing a lot of work with people like Thomas now and others, and we're some areas we will lead and other areas we'll support. And I think as we go through the next certainly couple of years, I think there is both challenges that we need to confront together, projecting the sector in as positive a light as possible alongside other conflicting priorities that others, governments, vice chancellors and others. And I also think talking to our different respective constituencies, we deliberately last year with the task force went to almost chair level within the businesses that we work with, not because they had greater insights on R&D than their chief technology officers, or R&D directors, but actually what was really interesting was it's such a mammoth mountain to scale to go from 1.6, 1.7% of GDP being spent on R&D to go to 2.4% in a relatively short period of time is a big leap. And so actually saying to a chairman of a big FTSE 100 company, why would you spend more on R&D than you would on something else? And they would say, well, yeah, that's a good provocation, because I'm going to have to challenge the executive team Is it marketing? Is it infrastructure? Is it training and development? And or R&D? And R&D's got to compete. Not all of the people on the task force were brilliant last year. They all committed to R&D. They love R&D and they think it's important for a whole raft of reasons. But I think what we need to do increasingly is understand their drivers and then capture that, and then work with other organizations to bring that to life. If it's about, if there are, areas for development that we think are recurring grumbles at that level, then, we need to cascade that down. But equally, all of the fantastic work that certainly many of the people on this call will be doing at the moment on the Concordat, on the KEF, on just day-to-day knowledge exchange activities, we need to bring to life and showcase as well on a national and sometimes we will have the ear of the vice chancellors, we'll have certainly the ear of policy officials. And so being able to take your stories and work collaboratively. And then, I certainly think when I look at Research England, UKRI, they are looking always to have one conversation with lots of people rather than lots of one-to-one conversations. So the more we're joined up and working in partnership, the better.
Yeah. And I think you're really good at showing the what and collecting the national picture, and we're really good at showing the how, and the fact that there are good ways of doing things, and some of them we've cracked and some of them we're working on, but that we have got a professional community that is doing this in a way that we think is one of the best in the world. So I think there is a good partnership to be had there. So, well, I think we've come to the end of our time. Thanks very much, Joe, for your great thoughts. We've covered an awful lot of ground, from talent and research through to the KEF, through to providing value for money, from telling stories about AI and impact and how we have to follow the money, and localism and civic missions and being active partners and placemaking, and so a whole range. So fantastic insights, Joe. Really, really good to hear from you today. And we certainly feel at PraxisAuril it would be great to keep building on the relationship that we have with Ncub. So I think that's all for me. I'm going to hand back to Maxine.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you, Joe and Sean. That was a really interesting session. And can I just say that I agree that NCUB and PraxisAuril have a very strong opportunity to leverage our respective strengths and connections to work together for the benefit of the entire sector. So I look forward to continuing that conversation. Great to be back in the shed. Good to see so many of you joining us. And come and see us again soon. Keep an eye on the newsletters and social media for details of many more PraxisAuril events coming up. And a special note in your diary for our conference, which will be running online from the 8th to the 10th of June. Look forward to seeing you at that or something else before then. But again, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Joe. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everyone.